Good morning and welcome to the inaugural installment of Southern States Energy Board's new webinar series. This past year has been difficult, but it's also had the benefit of pushing us to explore new ways of reaching out to our members, and this is one of those ways. I'm Turney Foshi. I'm the Communications and Design Specialist at SSEB, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This is a new series, and it's not meant to replace any of our traditional meetings, but it's meant to be more of a nimble and digestible approach to sharing information related to energy and environmental topics with our board and associate members. Today's discussion will be recorded and available on demand after the meeting. The information presented today should not be considered exhaustive or complete. We can't do that in an hour, but what we can do is open up new avenues of discussion. So today's subject is the current and future outlook for electric vehicles, or EVs, in the Southeast. If time allows, we'll toss out some questions to our guests before we adjourn today. You should also be able to leave questions in the chat. We don't have a whole lot of time, but I do hope we have time to get to at least a few today. A couple weeks from now, we're going to follow this webinar with a related session on the technology behind EVs batteries. We'll focus on the current limitations and future innovations in battery technology, as well as federal and industry response to market demands. And you can register now on our website. We're going to have Georgia Public Service Commission, Commissioner Tim Eccles, Stephen Boyd from the U.S. Department of Energy, and just this morning we confirmed Matt Renna, who is Volkswagen's Vice President of E-Mobility and Innovation. He'll be there to take questions as well. That's March 11th, same time, same place. But for today, we're going to focus on EV trends in the Southeast, what we can expect if these trends hold, and how legislatures can and are responding proactively to the accelerating sale of EVs. Throughout the nation right now, automakers are responding to that demand by increasing production of electric and hybrid vehicle lines. Just a few weeks ago, GM, the largest maker of American automobiles, announced that its entire fleet of light-duty models will be emission-free by 2035. That's only 14 years. 14 years is not a long time. 14 years, I have a 2-year-old. He might be driving one of those vehicles, or it might be driving him. I don't know. But in our member state of Tennessee, Volkswagen, like I mentioned, has also ramped up its production of EV offerings. Our member state of Florida made waves earlier this year when the Office of Energy released its Florida EV roadmap that includes infrastructure and grid resiliency recommendations. Later in today's webinar, Alexa Voytek will join us to tell us about Tennessee's efforts to ensure the smooth inclusion of EVs into the market. So yeah, let's just get right into it today. Joining us alongside Ms. Voytek, we have Joe Hoagland from TVA, Jennifer Weiss from the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions at Duke University, and we have Stan Cross from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. First up today is Stan. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Stan joined SACE in 2019, and it's there that he leads electric transportation policy and utility reform efforts across the Southeast. Thanks for joining us today, Stan. I'm going to turn the wheel over to you now, and you can give us an overview of the Southeast electric vehicle market.
Thank you, Turney, and hello to everybody. Glad to be here today. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Allow me to share my screen. You see the presentation now?
Yep, we can see it.
Good to go. Okay, great. So as Turney said, I serve as the Electric Transportation Policy Director at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. I oversee our Electrify the South program that's working with governor's offices, legislators, utilities, and commissioners, as well as local governments, fleet managers, and consumers to try to drive adoption of electric vehicles. Prior to joining the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I had founded and served as CEO for a company called Brightfield Transportation Solutions that was founded in 2009 to deploy charging infrastructure. So I have about a decade experience in the field of infrastructure as well as the policy work that I'm doing now. And I can say that it's really exciting to see how much this market has grown and the momentum that it has since I first started engaging back in 2009. So the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy partners with Atlas Public Policy to create reports that focus on electric transportation market in the Southeast. For us, that means focusing on Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. That's the territory that we as an organization are engaging in around electric transportation. Along with a report on the region as a whole, we also do reports on states that have momentum and that there's a strategic reason to put a report out for that state. We did one for Florida at the end of 2020 rather, and just published one for North Carolina as well. So the data that I'm going to share with you comes from our Transportation Electrification in the Southeast report. So let's dive in. So, to start talking about what's happening with electric transportation, as Turney had alluded, the best place to start is what's happening with automakers. And, we're seeing a lot of growth, both in terms of models that are being developed and in terms of the range of those vehicles, as well as the price point of those vehicles. As battery technology that you'll learn about in your next meeting is evolving, the cost of EVs is coming down and the range is going up. That's creating a much more desirable product for consumers and fleet managers. And that's a lot of what's behind the growth that we're seeing. You're also beginning to see more and more automakers engage in bigger and bolder ways, whether it's General Motors and Jaguar Land Rover that have both committed to 100% electrification, or Ford that just doubled its investment from 11 to 22 billion from now to 2025 to bring new models online. You're seeing increasing investment by the automakers in this transition. And remember, the transition's not just happening in the Southeast or in this country, it's a global transition. And that global opportunity is what's driving automakers to accelerate. So the next thing that I think is important for level setting is to follow the money. So in the EV space, there's been a tremendous amount of investment. This graph that Atlas Public Policy produces shows the flow of that investment. Where does it originate and where does it wind up? Currently, the US is pulling in about 20% of the $480 billion that has been invested so far globally. And as I'll show in a little while, the Southeast is capturing 30% of that US pot to grow manufacturing and jobs here in the Southeast. So part of the game here when we're talking about legislative and utility opportunities to drive adoption is to set the country up, and particularly the Southeast up, to draw in as much of this investment as possible to expand manufacturing and grow job opportunities in the region. The next thing that's important to look at is tracking sales of electric vehicles. There's a lot happening on this graph, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. Number one is you see, Tesla is the blue bar. So you can see how much Tesla's product offering is dominating the market. The spike that you see in 2018 is when the Tesla Model 3 was released, and there was a lot of bent up consumer desire for that vehicle. And the second bump that you see is really interesting, and that's in Q3 and Q4 of this year. Q4 tied for the strongest quarter yet for EV sales, which is somewhat surprising given the pandemic. And what we're seeing is electric vehicles are performing much better than internal combustion engines in terms of the recovery and are demonstrating a lot more resilience. The other thing that I want to point out is the top blue line that's moving across the graph represents the percentage of passenger vehicle cars sold that were electric. And you see that in Q4, we passed for the first time the 10% mark and are approaching 12% of all new passenger vehicles sold are electric. So when we look at the Southeast, again, that refers to North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida for our study, we're looking at a couple of key indicators. So one being EV manufacturing employment. Currently, we're only able to capture passenger employment, passenger EV. We don't have medium and heavy duty data publicly available yet, but when we update this report for 2021, we hope to be able to bring in that data. But just looking at passenger electric vehicles, you see a significant amount of jobs happening in the Southeast. The Southeast represents about 18% of the nation's population, and they're housing 14% of the nation's EV manufacturing jobs for passenger vehicles. And with that comes the investment. So as I alluded to before, of that pot of money the US is pulling in that global investment space, the Southeast is commanding almost 30% of that investment, which is significant and gives the region a really strong foundation to build off of. Part of the reason for that strength is that there is an existing auto industry presence here in the region. But another part of it is what's happening with new car companies and supply chain companies choosing to move to the Southeast to grow their businesses. When we look at EV sales and EV charging deployment, the region is lagging the rest of the country, and there's opportunity in both those areas to grow. Similarly, in utility investment and government funding for EVs, the region also lags, and there's emerging correlation between utility investment and certainly state policy in helping to drive adoption in this early market environment. So the more that's able to be unlocked from a utility investment standpoint, and the more that's able to be done around state policy and the directing of state funding, like the Volkswagen settlement money to electrification, the stronger the market is going to be. And when we look across the region and think about that manufacturing and those jobs, I think it's good to note that it's dispersed across the region. Certainly Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee lead. South Carolina has a strong presence as well, and North Carolina and Florida less so. But there's manufacturing happening in all of these states and more to build upon. Another interesting thing to watch is sort of what's happening across these states in terms of EV uptake. You see a spike, the red line is Georgia, and you see that spike in 2013 to 2015. That directly correlates with a state tax credit that was put in place in Georgia, which was effective at driving EV sales. It was a $5,000 state tax credit. When that tax credit went away, you see how sales plummeted after that. On the other hand, you have Florida, which is the green line, that showed a steady growth pattern despite not having financial incentives put in place or necessarily pro-EV policy in place. And so there's different drivers that you can unpack in these different states to see what's leading towards growth. And I think it's really interesting to look deeper into that. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that if you're a state looking to figure out how to accelerate adoption, best practices are starting to emerge, and research is pointing to certain policies and certain reforms that can lead to stronger market performance. Before I wrap up, I want to just look at this map of North Carolina and use it as a template for the Southeast. When we think about EV adoption and how it's trending across the region, it's important to recognize that the Southeast is a region that has a number of large and mid-sized cities dispersed across an otherwise rural landscape. And what we're seeing with early adoption is most of the EV charger deployment and car sales are happening in urban areas. So if we look at North Carolina, for example, that's the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill area, the Charlotte area, and the Asheville area where I live. So in those areas, you have really strong infrastructure that builds confidence in consumers to buy electric vehicles. And then the more consumers that are buying electric vehicles, the more other consumers are seeing those vehicles on the road and thinking about buying them themselves. So there's this sort of positive feedback loop that starts to happen. An important thing to keep in consideration is that as we move from an early adopter market where this might be acceptable into a more mass market, we got to recognize that the benefits of electrification currently are being disproportionately allocated to those markets where growth is strong. And so I drive my EV here in Asheville, I get to enjoy savings of about $1,300 a year driving that electric vehicle. As more and more electric vehicles hit the road, those EVs are emitting zero tailpipe emissions, which lead to cleaner air, which improve public health in the communities where those EVs exist. So those are two sort of discrete benefits that currently are not shared equitably across the region. And then the third is that, as electrification scales, and not just passenger cars, but trucks and buses as well, you're going to have more electricity consumed and be able to disperse the capital expenditure of that electricity over a larger user base, which has the potential result of putting downward pressure on electric utility rates. So if we look at the map here in North Carolina, Asheville, Charlotte, and the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill area are all Duke Energy territory. So for Duke Energy customers, that downward pressure on rates is going to be another economic benefit that they're going to be able to enjoy as a result of transportation electrification. But the electric member co-ops that are serving the rural areas of the state may not have the same opportunity, and their customers may not have the same opportunity. So the point I'm trying to make is, from an economic benefit standpoint and from a public health benefit standpoint, it's important that we look at the policies that are going to drive equitable access to the benefits of transportation electrification. Because if the market's left to its own devices, it's likely that the areas of strong adoption will continue to be areas of strong adoption, and the areas of weak adoption will continue to be weak. So I'll end with a picture of my electric vehicle and my dog Epi. I've been driving an EV for 7 years, and I will never go back. The experience from a performance standpoint is better than the internal combustion engine car that I still have. My wife and I have one Leaf and one Subaru Forester, and with that combination, we can do everything we need to do. We can save money, and we can enjoy the driving experience of an electric vehicle. As soon as there's an EV that can handle my kayaks and my mountain bikes, I will happily go to a 2 EV car family because the experience is just that good. Thank you, Tony. I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Let me make sure I'm unmuted here. Yeah, there we go. Looks like we temporarily lost Jennifer, so we're just going to skip ahead to you if that's okay.
Sure.
Let me just run through your introduction. I'm sorry. Let's see. You're from Tennessee Valley Authority. You are the VP of Innovation and Research, and you're here to discuss the infrastructural response to the EV demand, such as your recently announced fast charge network. So yeah, just go ahead and run through your presentation for us, Joe.
All right, I'd be happy to start sharing. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. TVA and lots of stakeholders working with us in the Tennessee Valley have been working hard for a number of years to figure out what's the right way to accelerate electric vehicle evolution in the Valley. And I think the data that Stan just provided, I think is really helpful for this conversation. It kind of sets the stage for some of the challenges that we have to work for. When we think about electrification from our perspective, we see it as a huge market opportunity, not only for TVA, but for the Valley itself. It's an opportunity to reduce the largest source of CO2 outside of the utility industry. It is obviously a potential for sales growth from our perspective, but as Stan pointed out, the more electrification we can put in place, the better we can manage the power system and better manage the assets. That reduces the costs of operating those assets, and it effectively reduces the overall carbon emission from any of those assets because they're operating at their most efficient position. There's an opportunity to invest locally here. You keep, instead of sending fuel money somewhere else, the fuel money stays within the Valley, and it helps with economic development. Stan already mentioned the car manufacturers that are in the Valley. We're trying to work with battery developers to locate in the Valley, as well as all the ancillary things. And it provides brand position, not only for the utility, but for companies. It demonstrates, the region as a place that's sustainable and green. We started out on our effort to set a kind of an intermediate goal of something like 200,000 electric vehicles by 2028. When we started all this, that seemed like an incredibly hard goal. As Stan just pointed out in his charts, the growth of EVs is beginning to pick up very quickly. So we think that goal will probably need to be revised, but that's where we're starting. With 200,000 EVs within the Valley, we'll have 200 million in fuel savings for consumers. That allows about 120 million per year to be reinvested in the local economy. And it reduces 1 million metric tons of carbon per year. So, and 200,000 is not a large percentage of the cars within the Valley, but it gives us a place to start and a place to go from, and it demonstrates just how much value it can bring. And so part of it is about the EVs itself. It's already been mentioned, we've got within our service territory, you have Chattanooga, Nissan, and General Motors that not only have significant production facilities, but have all made commitments to produce electric vehicles in the area. They all have secondary companies that work for them. And so, we're hoping as part of our efforts is to create a place where not only do people want to drive electric vehicles, but car manufacturers want to produce the electric vehicles. And once those electric vehicles are produced, they're sold in the Valley rather than shipped off to other markets. As I mentioned, and I think Alexa will talk more about this, but we started a partnership a number of years ago with a lot of stakeholders, particularly in the state of Tennessee, to help us figure out how do we go about this. That resulted in a roadmap that was called Drive Electric Tennessee. Great roadmap. But it helped identify things for us that we were considered in the area market barriers, things that were preventing people from moving ahead with getting into the electric vehicle market. And what we determined was there were basically 4 large areas that were a challenge. The first of those was around innovative policies and pricing. It's making sure that people could sell electricity, sell it at a rate that made sense. It is a challenge, and it's a challenge for consumers to be able to understand. The second was around charging infrastructure and its availability within the Valley. Range anxiety is a huge issue for folks. And so when we interviewed folks and worked with others, it was very clear that people were nervous about getting into electric vehicles because they weren't sure where they can charge them. Now, obviously you can charge them at home, but if you're out and about or you're going on a longer trip, right, it's been a large concern for folks. We also found out that consumer awareness was a large issue within the Valley. When we started this effort, and with some initial interviewing that we did, that was almost 70% of the folks that we interviewed knew very little about electric vehicles, about the vehicles themselves, about how they could purchase them, about how they would use them. And so a significant issue. And then last is just the cars themselves, right? Now that, as Stan pointed out, that is changing, and is changing at an incredibly fast rate. So I think there's going to be much more in the way of passenger vehicles available soon. But now, you know, we also need to look and consider things such as transportation fleets from delivery services and other commercial activities to, you know, large scale trucking. Excuse me. So over the last few months, TVA has, working with partners such as the state of Tennessee and others, has really begun to say, you know, what are the things we need to do in these 4 areas to take these barriers out and allow folks to be able to reduce the anxieties to be able to get into the electric vehicle market and feel comfortable about it. The first thing we did was back in November, our board passed 2 policies. The first was to approve a wholesale rate structure that was on a kilowatt hour basis to make it a simple flat structure that would be consistent throughout the valley. The local power companies that we serve, they have an opportunity to put a retail rate on it on top of ours, but we believe that what we will end up with is something where the price is competitive and is fairly similar all the way across the valley, so that folks that are driving will understand what they can and what gas, or the equivalent of gas, the electricity is going to cost them. The second policy our board approved was a policy around third-party sales. Normally in a utility jurisdiction, you cannot, only the utility can sell electricity. That's a requirement. We carved out electric vehicle charging and said no, that was a situation where we would allow third parties to be able to sell electricity. That will help enable the marketplace so that folks that are wanting to put in charging stations, or, you know, maybe the gas station of the future, that would allow them to be able to do that. Then this past February, or this past board meeting a few weeks ago, our board approved another program where we are going to work with the state of Tennessee and others in the valley to put in fast chargers every 50 miles along the major interstates and major highways within the region. By doing that, we are hopefully going to really significantly reduce the range anxiety that people feel. Right now, you should be able to buy an electric vehicle when this is complete, and anywhere within 50 miles, you should be able to find a charging station. This will take us a few years to complete, but we think this will be a really great step. We've also started an effort, again in partnership with others, developing a number of educational activities, a new website. I encourage everybody to go look at that. Really helps people understand the issues or challenges or just general information around electric vehicles, to help them make informed decisions when they want to buy one and have one available. And that education effort will be a large push for us. And then last, we're beginning to focus more with car manufacturers on how can we work with them to make sure their products stay within the valley. I won't spend much time on this slide, but this gives you a sense of our service territory and gives you a bit of a framework of where charging stations, fast chargers are available today. Our goal will be to fill in all those spots where you don't see the blue dots, so that you'll have one every 50 miles. And we think that will be a huge gain for folks. And with that, I'm turning it back to Turney.
Let me go ahead and just do a quick intro for you, Alexa. As Joe mentioned, TVA is coordinating with numerous state offices, including the Department of Environment and Conservation, and that's where Alexa currently works. So to drive home, well, it would have driven things home today. This would have been our last speaker. Sorry. Hopefully, Jennifer is able to join us before we end, but we're going to move on to you, Alexa. You're here to tell us about some other EV initiatives that the state of Tennessee is doing, like the Southeast Regional Electric Vehicle Information Exchange. So thank you for joining us, Alexa. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen as well. Great. So thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Turney, for the opportunity. We appreciate, and to the Southern States Energy Board, I appreciate the chance to get to speak with you all today. I'm going to try not to duplicate anything that Joe just touched on and that other folks have touched on, so as to provide some additional color and context around the general landscape here and some of the stuff that we're doing in Tennessee. I know Joe did highlight Drive Electric Tennessee, and so to just kind of step back, I would say that this has really been the effort that kickstarted a lot of the work and the synergies that are now coming to fruition within Tennessee. This effort, which really began in 2018, I think it's significant to note because of how it was driven by a multi-stakeholder process to essentially compile this shared vision and goals for driving electric transportation within the state of Tennessee. And so you can see on the screen just a few of the stakeholders that were involved in that multi-stakeholder road mapping effort, whether it be the auto manufacturers themselves, local governments, state government, utilities, nonprofits, advocacy, and so forth. And so this really, to us, helped us build kind of that baseline for what we should be working on in order to drive electric vehicle adoption over the next 5 to 10 years. That effort, as Joe mentioned, resulted in the publishing of the roadmap, which came out in 2019. The primary goal of this roadmap that's outlined is to drive the light-duty EV population to 200,000 EVs by 2028. This slide says 5,000, but we're actually, as of December 2020, in Tennessee, we had a little over 11,000 registered EVs within the state of Tennessee. And so we have a lot of work to get to the 200,000 goal, but the roadmap, it identifies over 40 projects that we could be working on in those 4 opportunity areas that Joe mentioned in order to kind of chip away and help drive that adoption. Another piece that I wanted to mention, another kind of key deliverable that Drive Electric Tennessee accomplished also in 2019, we conducted a statewide electric vehicle charging infrastructure needs assessment. And so essentially what this did was it highlighted the condition of our current existing charging infrastructure network, and it identified the geographic areas where new infrastructure should be placed and the use cases of that infrastructure in order to help meet that 200,000 electric vehicle population, the demand that would be expected from that vehicle population by 2028. So some of the key takeaways of this needs assessment, just to highlight those for you, it found that whereas high demand EV charging sites can attract private investment, such as the chargers that you might see at like retail charging or community charging in high traffic areas, lower demand EV charging sites such as corridor charging or rural charging is not as appealing for private investors in the short term until the population of EVs increases. And so as such, we found that there was a critical need there that may require investment from public entities or from utilities. The needs assessment also found that EV charging infrastructure should be prioritized for the highway corridors and for rural tourism destinations in order to relieve that range anxiety and to connect our urban areas with our rural areas. So I will say that following the recommendations of the needs assessment, TDEC incorporated within our 4-year strategy for 2020 to 2024. In our strategic plan, we incorporated this goal to work on the establishment of a network that would cover primary and secondary corridors, and would seek to essentially supplement that EV charging infrastructure in order to achieve, as Joe mentioned, charging infrastructure every 50 miles. And so we're very pleased that we've been able to work with TVA on this and announce this earlier this month. So shifting away from Tennessee-specific efforts, I do want to highlight for you all a new effort that Tennessee has kickstarted that has a more regional focus. And you can see here the states that are involved. These are all the states that are categorized as being in the Southeast region, according to kind of how the National Association of State Energy Officials treats the Southeast region and DOE as well. And so this effort was somewhat inspired by the Rev West initiative that you all have maybe heard of, which was an MOU that was signed between 8 Western states to essentially work together on coordination with regard to minimum operating standards for EV charging stations and coordination on, corridor infrastructure and so forth. So in the Southeast region, we wanted to create a touch point for Southeastern state energy offices in order to be able to kind of share information and best practices amongst one another, fully acknowledging that a lot of us are doing work in this space. And so we want to be all on the same page with regard to how we can collaborate and help each other and how we can achieve some level of consistency as well as a result. And so some of the kind of the key areas of collaboration that we're looking at are, EV infrastructure planning itself, whether that be siting and securing of site hosts, permitting, pricing, signage, minimum operating standards, accessibility, ownership models, et cetera, as well as the education outreach, policy development, and program implementation. This group is also very keen to also evaluate how to promote electric transportation in communities that are rural, low income, or that face disproportionate air quality burdens, as well as the role of EV infrastructure during evacuations, given that we're in the Southeast, and the considerations with regard to electric vehicles to build resiliency into our power supply delivery. So we're fortunate that we have the support of both the National Association of State Energy Officials as well as the Duke Nicholas Institute in supporting this effort with regard to facilitation, technical assistance, and research. I'll say that this group has just convened a couple times, but we will be meeting on a bi-monthly basis, and we came up with a list of 11 projects that we would like to tackle. And so we just recently did a poll to try and prioritize which projects we want to tackle first. And so I'll just tell you the top 5. We will work on completing an infrastructure mapping exercise for the region so that we can identify corridors and areas of priority for the Southeast region that we want to look at. We will look at an EV infrastructure planning best practices document. We will compile information on what our utilities are planning and utility-related investments in the region, knowing that the Southeast is has been mentioned, is a very strong place for electric vehicle investment by manufacturers and key parts suppliers. We want to compile a running list of who those players are that have made investments within the Southeast region and outline the supply chain so that we can better understand what are our strengths in the region in that space. And then lastly, we want to convene with manufacturers to try and address the issue of EV availability and making sure that vehicles can be sold within our region. And so the way that this will be tackled is we will probably tackle a project at a time. And so the infrastructure mapping exercise is the first out of the gate. I think the goal there is to have something that would be publicly accessible and visible on a website such that you could toggle on and off different layers perhaps and see, corridors as they, which corridors pass through economically distressed areas or which corridors are key evacuation corridors and that sort of thing. So that's something that we'll be working on over the coming months. Another effort that I wanted to just quickly flag for you all is called Drive Electric USA. And I've listed at the top here the states that are Southern States Energy Board members. This is a 14-state effort the U.S. Department of Energy just selected this project to receive funding, which will essentially focus very similarly. I think it's modeled after the Drive Electric Tennessee effort in some ways, but how to drive EV adoption in these states. And so this project is being led by the Tennessee Clean Fuels, East Tennessee Clean Fuels Coalition, as well as Clean Fuels Ohio. The two of them are kind of co-leading this. And so they will seek to advance state-of-the-art innovative approaches to reduce the EV market barriers and create what they're calling a replication playbook that other states can utilize to further their own initiatives. And so a lot of this is similar to what's been going on in Tennessee in terms of educating consumers directly and engaging all of our utilities, looking at corridor, interstate infrastructure planning, engaging dealerships and OEMs and so forth. So just wanted to flag this for you all if you hadn't heard about it. And there is a website, I think, driveelectricusa.org. And I think that's all. So thank you again. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much, Alexa. That was really informative. You know, we're always happy to hear about collaboration between our members. And now we do have Jennifer back on with us. So we're gonna do a little U-turn here and go back to her. She's gonna discuss more broadly that collaborative approach to EV policy. So let's just go ahead and throw things to you, Jennifer.
So hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Weiss from the Duke Nicholas Institute. And I'm really excited to be talking today about some regional opportunities, things that are going on. Just very quickly, if you've not heard of the Nicholas Institute, we are part of Duke University. Our mission is to help decision makers create timely, effective, and practical solutions to the environmental challenges. And the reason I say this is that we work a lot with utilities commissions, state agencies like state energy offices, departments of environmental quality, departments of air quality, even some departments of transportation. And what we try to do is learn about the types of things that are really keeping them up at night, things that they really want to be learning more about, and to give them some applicable research that they can use. And for the past, I would say almost 3 years now, electrification, transportation electrification specifically, has been one of the top things that they want to learn more about. So I'm excited to be here talking about it with all of you as well. And one of the things that we've done in the Southeast is to take a look, and Alexa just talked a little bit about this, but take a look at what's happening in other regions. What are other regions doing collaboratively that is advancing transportation electrification? And so I want to share a little bit about what some of the other regions are doing, as well as talk more specifically about what's happening here in the Southeast. Hopefully. All right, so why would we even be considering regional EV collaboration? We put together a policy brief a few years ago to kind of outline some of the things, the benefits that can happen in a region when you start to collaborate across state borders. One is obviously just coordinating the network of charging infrastructure. So making sure that someone can get from point A to point B in an easy way in an electric vehicle. The second is to really focus in on rural communities and make sure that EVs are accessible in those communities as well, because sometimes when we build out the infrastructure, we're just looking at the main corridors. We want to keep in mind that, you know, within all of the Southeast states, there are rural communities that also need to be linked in. We want to be thinking about the minimum standards for the EV infrastructure. You know, as people are charging along a highway or going out to a tourist destination, you want to make sure that the standards are the same so that they'll be able to charge wherever they go. Want to make sure that we're building new buildings and even retrofitting old buildings that they are EV ready, that we will be able to charge wherever a building may be. Look for economic development opportunities. Stan talked a lot about this. There are so many opportunities in the Southeast. And so we want to be, as a region, looking for those opportunities and working together to bring them here. And then finally, just a regional plan. How are we going to market and educate and do outreach to increase EV adoption in the region? So, there's things going on, and I know you've all heard about it, right, throughout the U.S., right? And this is a map that the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center puts together, and it shows that in every state in the U.S. there are different types of actions, legislative, regulatory, and other, going on in the states. What I want to talk about this today is just a few collaborations between states, and Alexa already mentioned Rev West, so I'll talk a little bit about that. Also a multi-state ZEV task force, which is some Northeast states as well as California and Oregon, a Northeast EV network, and then finally a more recent one, a transportation climate initiative. So I'll just go into a little bit detail on each of these. The Rev West, as Alexa said, was facilitated by NASIO. It is a MOU that was signed by 8 governors in the mountain states, and you can see them right there. This was a bipartisan group, and they all re-signed again in 2019, and there were a few new governors there. So this is a very important thing for this region. And what it does is provide a framework for creating what they're calling an Intermountain West Electric Vehicle Corridor. So they want to make sure that all of their highways have electric vehicle access. They want to promote tourism and recreation in rural communities, similar to what we are looking at in the Southeast. And they want to support state and regional economies. And so they're putting together best practices, procedures, and voluntary minimum standards in that region. And that is something in the Southeast that we are trying to mimic. The second one I talked about was a multi-state ZEV task force. This is facilitated by a group up in outside of Boston, I believe, NESCOM. This was formed again by a governor's MOU in 2013, and there are currently 10 states working together to identify and remove barriers to ZEV adoption. They put together a ZEV action plan back in 2018, and all of the task force member states have adopted California's ZEV requirements from their Clean Air Act, Section 177, which is a little bit more stringent than the federal guidelines. Collectively, they have a target of at least 3.3 million ZEVs. This is light duty by 2025, and they're working together to map that out as well as a fueling infrastructure. This is the ZEV action plan that I referred to. This was put out in June 2018 by all of the task force states, and it identifies just 5 key areas, and you can see them there: consumer education and outreach, infrastructure, consumer purchase incentives, light duty fleets, and dealerships. And I encourage you all, if you haven't seen it, to go look at this action plan, because it gives a really good roadmap for where these states are heading. And then finally, also part of the same group, they last July signed another MOU, this time for medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles. This was signed by governors in 15 states and the District of Columbia this time, including one state in the Southeast, North Carolina. So they're working now collectively to advance the market in the medium and heavy duty vehicles, and they have a goal to ensure that 100% of all new vehicle sales are zero emission by 2050, with an interim target of 30% by 2030. And then last but certainly not least is the Transportation Climate Initiative. This is a group of Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states, and it's facilitated by Georgetown Climate Center. This is a group that seeks to reduce carbon emissions. And if you're familiar with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, this is set up similar to it, only for the transportation sector. In fact, in December of 2020, 3 states and DC launched a market-based cap and invest program similar to RGGI for the transportation, and they are looking for other states to sign on to that as well. I'm not going to go here because Alexa already very brilliantly talked about the EV information exchange, but here in the Southeast, this is one of the ways that we are starting to have more discussions collaboratively about electrification. And then on a parallel path, calling this a regional EV partnership, a group of academics, utilities, nonprofit organizations, auto manufacturers, and supply companies have gotten together to really drive a path to help with economic development and new technologies and education and outreach. And so we're working kind of in parallel with the State Energy Office team to make sure that we're aligned and helping each other to get where we want to go. And then finally, I'll end with a few state initiatives. It was already mentioned about the Florida EV roadmap, which came out last year, at the end of last year, but also Tennessee, and I probably missed it, but Alexa probably talked about their Drive Electric plan in 2018. North Carolina had a ZEV plan in 2019. Alabama just came out with an infrastructure plan. South Carolina just kicked off their own EV stakeholder initiative last week. And so they'll be coming up with a roadmap probably by the end of this year, early 2022. And that's it for me. Thank you all very much for your time, and thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm really glad you were able to sort out your technical issues there and join us, because that was very informative. We actually have quite a bit of time left over for some questions. So we're going to move right into those. If you guys want to take a crack at any of these, feel free, just, unmute yourselves as you need to. First question actually came from registration. We had an attendee point out that St. Louis is the first city in Missouri to adopt ordinances that will require all new construction, business and residential, to be built with some level of EV charging readiness beginning in 2022. So his question was, are you seeing that evolution in other cities or states in the SSEB region?
This is Stan. I'll go ahead and start a response. Yes, we are. There are mostly at the local government level. So cities like Atlanta, a number of local governments in Florida are also putting in place ordinances that require EV make ready. And the reason for that is when you are in a new construction situation, it's very cost effective to make sure your panel box is sized appropriately for the breakers necessary to operate EV charging stations, and that the conduit that's necessary for those charging stations is laid so that when the chargers get deployed, you don't have to tear up parking lots any longer. You just have to install breakers, pull wires, and mount chargers. That can reduce the cost of installing an charging infrastructure by as much as half. So looking to stretch dollars, whether it's private entity funding the charging infrastructure, or whether it's state dollars from Volkswagen settlements or utility provided rebates, whatever it may be, by investing in Make Ready, it's a very cost-effective way to invest in future infrastructure. We're not seeing it as actively at the state level. However, there are efforts among advocates to begin to work with building code councils and others in states to understand the value of Make Ready and ultimately adjust state code to require Make Ready in appropriate ways to advance infrastructure.
Yeah, and this is Alexa. I would just piggyback on that to say, at least in Tennessee, we have seen some interest in this topic, as Dan said, at the local level, particularly from Nashville, I would say. Given that Tennessee is a home rule state with regard to building energy codes, we typically see code adoption for larger cities driven at the local level. And, for smaller communities that don't choose to adopt their own, they may adopt the state's program, but often we do see those cities doing it at the local level.
Okay, we can move on to our next question now if you guys are ready. We actually had a question from one of our members, Representative John Reagan asked, for all of you, by what date will a significant portion of the vehicles on the road be electric? I know that might be a hard date to pin down, but I guess we can speak broadly here. Does anyone want to take a crack at that? You might want to.
So this is Joe. Stan's probably got a better perspective, but we've been trying to answer that question because it's really important from a utility standpoint to figure out, how long does it take and how do we need to be prepared for that? I think if the current momentum continues and the vehicles that are coming out from the manufacturers meet expectations and are affordable, we're thinking a good majority of the vehicles could be electrified, by 2035, 2040, kind of given the way the world looks. But that's a really tough question.
All right.
I'll come at that just looking at the state of Florida, where the Department of Transportation has been doing a lot of work as part of the state's legislatively mandated electric vehicle master plan. And they ran analysis using more than a dozen forecasting tools, ranging from market-based approaches like Bloomberg New Energy Finance to Renewable Energy Lab analyses. And what they've determined is that if appropriate policies to support EV adoption are put in place, that by 2040, 35% of all the vehicles on the road in Florida will be electric. So 1 out of every 3 will be electric, which results in millions and millions of electric vehicles. And so that's based on sort of not really being able to calculate the cumulative effect of kind of market growth building upon itself, battery prices coming down, awareness expanding among consumers. So from Florida's perspective, even at a conservative level, you're going to see significant penetration happening over these next 15 to 20 years.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything else? Okay, we can move on to this next question here. It's very relevant, I would say, timely question, but maybe difficult to answer as well. But someone asked that they're wanting to hear about the plan for EV charging stations during emergency evacuations where outages are widespread. I guess how we could mitigate the problems with that.
I can start with that. Yeah, I mean, that's become like, I think one of the top priorities when you start talking to all of the states about it. And so starting to think that through. I don't think there's a plan in place, but it certainly needs to be part of the rollout of electric vehicles and the infrastructure especially. So I don't have an answer for you, but definitely top of the list for things that we need to be thinking about.
Right.
Yeah, I would say, I would echo Jen's comments, and I think it's something that we're just really kind of rolling our sleeves up on and trying to really wrap our heads around. Some interesting things that have happened recently. New York City has done a lot with fleet electrification. And I saw that they had been doing some stuff with off-grid movable solar powered electric vehicle chargers that can kind of be easily shifted to different locations. So from a resiliency perspective, you could have different things like that could be deployed in an instance where you might need it. So, and from the corridor perspective, obviously trying to think through, evacuation corridors we've had around for a while now, but then tying it to charging infrastructure is a new layer that we'll have to think about how best to do that.
I'll add a couple of points to this. One is that the Department of Energy has funded projects in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida to look at the resilience of alternative fueling infrastructure, including electric charging stations, looking at storm disruptions and looking at how to prepare for more frequent and stronger storms in the future. So that planning work is underway. And one of the things that we recognize is that when the power's out, gas station fuel pumps don't work either. And when we look at the time to get services back online, when we've had storm events where we've lost access to liquid fuels, it's taken days or weeks to get that liquid fuel flowing back to regions that have been cut off. Whereas electricity tends to come back on, the Texas situation that we all just witnessed aside, relatively quickly. The other thing that we're looking at when we think about the resilience of electrification is that you can build in sources of redundancy. So imagine if you're a school district and you electrify your school buses. If the power goes out, those buses represent stored energy generators that can be used to power shelters, that can be used to charge other cars, can be used for first responder access. There's also the ability to integrate renewable energy and battery storage into EV charging when you have hotspots where you want to build out resiliency, where you can access that stored energy that's generated daily through the solar panels to help keep vital vehicles rolling. So there are solutions out there and studies happening around this issue. And I think that what's going to get really interesting is when we start stacking kind of the benefits of medium and heavy duty electrification and adding to those benefits the ability to use those vehicles in emergency response to power other vehicles and other services.
All right. That's really interesting. I think somewhat related to that is another question we had about, and you kind of touched on this, Stan, what EV batteries can do potentially down the line as far as providing power back to the grid. Is that something that, we're seeing being worked on, or whoever wants to take that one?
I'll let Joe take a first crack at that one if you'd like to.
Yeah, so the short answer to that question is yes. I think there's a real potential to be able to utilize batteries in support of the grid. There's a number of research efforts and demonstrations actually going on around the country where they're doing vehicle to grid and grid to vehicle demonstrations. It's a bit of a trick because you have to be able to integrate the car into the grid and do it in a way that the grid can manage it and control it in a way that's appropriate. So it's not a problem in terms of the battery and the charging technology. It's making sure all of the communications work correctly to bring it in. And I think you're going to see within the next few years a good opportunity to do that. Now, one of the hurdles, which we're working with OEMs on, is for them to get comfortable that their batteries might be used differently in their vehicle. They have, some of them at this point currently have concerns which they may void the warranty associated with the vehicle. But, and I appreciate those concerns, but I think those can be mitigated to the point where they'll get comfortable with that here in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, and I will just add that, and I'm not sure if everybody saw it this morning, there was an article that came out in the E&E News about, I think it was Montgomery County up in Maryland, that just is working with a third party to electrify, I want to say over 1,000, all of their school buses. And the plan is to be able to use those for storage and sell it back to the grid, actually through the wholesale market up there, PJM. So it's certainly at a large scale. I think people are starting to think about how can we do this at a large scale. It might be more difficult, as Joe's saying, on the individual basis.
Right. Anything else? All right,
Just
we can move on.
back to the just to tie back quickly to the conversation about EV make ready, right? So when we're thinking about these potentials of that the electric vehicles can deliver, whether it's, whether it's to how we move around or how we, help balance loads in our buildings and on the grid, what's critical is that we start to do that initial planning today. And the things that we know we're going to need in place, whether that's infrastructure, underground infrastructure for charging stations, or whether that's capacity in buildings for vehicle to grid integration, that we're building those in now so that the costs are kept down to integrate that technology later.
Yeah, Stan, I think that's a great point. I think that's going to be one of the critical issues for utilities all over.
All right, I think we've got time at least for one more to fit in here. This question came from registration. Do you think the supply chain is ready to support EV infrastructure, and who are the major players in that infrastructure sector? No, that's a big question.
That is a big question. It's a good one, though. You go ahead, Joe. You can kick it off.
Well, yeah. So I was just going to echo what I think Stan said. It is a big question. Part of it, again, has to do with the pace of change. I think, so when I think of electric chargers, I think of two sets of infrastructure. There's what I call the charging station itself. So think of like ChargePoint as an example of a company that would have that interface between the vehicle and what I would normally traditionally think about as grid infrastructure. And that grid infrastructure now becomes the part that we have to either build new or enhance existing. And as Stan has already done a good job explaining, do it and plan for it in such a way that you make facilities ready. The companies that go behind that are sort of the traditional, people that provide transformers and wires and electronics. That's there. If it doesn't grow too fast, I don't see any problem with that. I think more of the challenge, at least from my perspective, is how fast do the folks at the interface, can they meet growing demand? But tough question.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Joe's assessment. I think that from the charging station company perspective, we see a tremendous amount of growth and a lot of capacity and capability there. We're also seeing a lot more sophistication from EV charging companies in terms of the nuance that they're able to offer from both a hardware product and also, equally importantly, the software product to be able to really meet customers where they're at. The point in the sort of ecosystem that tends to slow everything down is exactly what Joe was talking about. Is that utility interconnection, that can be challenging, especially when we start looking at deploying infrastructure at scale. And so for site hosts to be able to evaluate, understand their interconnection constraints and opportunities is a critical, piece to all of this to allow, everything to flow effectively. But we do have a lot of electricians. And at the end of the day, installing this infrastructure is just another piece of electrical hardware to install. So just to demystify that, it's not rocket science, right? So an electrician can easily understand what to do and do it well and do it effectively. So we've got plenty of boots on the ground and opportunity again in another sector to really grow jobs by deploying this infrastructure.
Okay. Let's see, how are we on time? Well, we're right up against the end here, so I think we're gonna go ahead. Yeah, we've got a lot of questions that we didn't get to. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here, obviously, and we just can't really cover everything in a short amount of time. But I think we did get to a lot today. Let's see. I know it's a broad lane to explore. We can really only sketch a rudimentary map of the paths toward facilitating EV production and adoption, but we hope our members and other attendees can fill in those details in their own time. I want to thank everyone for attending today. Thank you to our presenters, Stan Cross, Jennifer Weiss, Joe Hoagland, and Alexa Voytek. And I want to remind you that we will have a second webinar in 2 weeks to focus on batteries. I think some of the issues we talked about today can be mitigated with improved battery technology. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, DOE investment, things like that. It's March 11th. So we're going to go ahead and end it here. Thanks, everyone. Good talk. See you next time.